Calvin Brooks was 42 years old, the founder of a civil engineering and construction management firm that had grown from 2 employees to 67 over 14 years without losing a single client to a competitor. He carried a red pen. Every document that crossed his desk, blueprints, contracts, proposals, expense reports, came back with his marks on it in red, and his team knew that if the red marks weren't there, he hadn't read it yet. He read everything. On a Thursday afternoon in May, his wife Dina packed 2 bags and told him she was leaving for someone she had met through a professional network. Someone, she said, who actually inspired her. She did not give Calvin the name. She didn't know he would recognize it. The man she left him for had been on his payroll for 3 years. He had signed Anton Gale's offer letter himself. He had read his resume, his references, his background check. He had shaken his hand at the hire and said, "Solid work, welcome to the firm." He had made the call, the way he made every hire personally, because his judgment of people was the thing he was most proud of in 14 years of building. It was also, as it turned out, the place Anton had chosen to attack. She had no idea who she was running to, and Anton had been counting on that. Before we jump into the story, comment where in the world you are watching from and subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you need to hear. The office was dark when Calvin arrived at 5:57 in the morning. He liked it that way. He made coffee in the kitchen off the main floor, sat at the drafting table in the corner of his office, a habit from the early years, when he had been the one drawing the plans, and worked through the morning's documents in the order they needed attention. The red pen uncapped, the markings precise. By the time the first employees arrived at 8, the things that needed deciding had been decided. Calvin Brooks had started his firm at 28 with a structural engineering license, a single municipal contract, and a rule he had kept from the first hire to the 67th. He read every application himself, conducted every final interview personally, and made every offer decision without delegation, not because he didn't trust his team, because he understood that a firm was made of people and that getting people right was the load-bearing work that everything else rested on. In 14 years, he had been wrong about 3 hires. All 3 had been caught early, handled cleanly, and separated without damage to the firm. He had learned from each one and adjusted his process. He had hired Anton Gale 3 years ago. He had read his file. He had shaken his hand. He had thought, strong analytical instincts, good instincts with contractors, the kind of project manager who would be running his own firm in 10 years if he stayed hungry. He had not been wrong about any of those things. He had been wrong about something that didn't appear in the file. He didn't know, arriving at his office those mornings, that Dina had been ready to leave for almost 8 months, that the distance between them she had described as the natural stretch of a marriage under pressure had been, for most of that time, something else entirely. He had told himself the company's growth phase was creating friction at home. He had told himself they would recalibrate when the season slowed. He had extended the benefit of the doubt because that was what he did, because he believed in people, and because he had always been the last person to update his assessment when the evidence was incomplete. He had not understood that the evidence had been there for a year, and he had filed it away each time without acting on it. She was in the kitchen when he came home that Thursday. The house smelled like the diffuser she ran in the afternoons, the cedar and citrus one he had bought her 2 birthdays ago. 2 bags were packed and standing in the hallway, not hidden, not staged, just present. She had not tried to manage how he would find them. She was standing at the counter with her coat on and her keys already in her hand. "I'm leaving," she said. "I've made the decision, and I've thought about it long enough that I'm not going to go back and forth on it. I wanted to tell you myself." He set his bag down by the table. He looked at the bags in the hall. He looked at her. "I've been seeing someone," she said. "It's been going on for about 8 months. He's someone I met through a professional connection, an event, not work. He's a project manager, actually." A brief, specific pause. "He inspires me. He's building towards something. I feel like I've been waiting for you to want that kind of momentum, and it's not who you are. I don't think it ever will be." Calvin looked at the counter. He thought about 14 years of 5:57 mornings and red pen marks on every document and 67 people whose files he had read himself. He thought about what building towards something would look like to a woman who had stopped asking what he was building. "His name," Calvin said. She shook her head slightly. "It doesn't matter right now." "His name," he said again. She looked at him. She said a name. He kept his expression the same. He had heard the name before. He knew the face that went with it. He could describe the man's work history, his last 3 performance reviews, the project he was currently managing on the Eastfield contract. He noticed something else, the specific way she said the name, with a warmth and a certainty she had not directed at Calvin in a long time. He noticed the confidence in it. She believed she was leaving for something larger. She had no idea she was describing a man who had spent the last 3 years building his position on Calvin's payroll and the last 8 months building something else on Calvin's time. He picked up his bag from the table. He walked it to the back of the house and set it down and stood at the window. For a moment, the yard quiet in the late afternoon. "I'll call Jeffrey," he said. She left through the front door. He heard the car back out of the drive. He stood at the window for a while longer. He was running through the sequence of what he was going to need to do. Not fast, in the right order, the way he did everything. 5 years before that Thursday, Calvin had spent 4 months helping Dina develop the client acquisition strategy for her interior design practice. She had been transitioning from residential to commercial work, and the transition required a different kind of pitch, different documents, different timelines, different decision-makers on the other side of the table. He had sat with her at the kitchen table and worked through it the same way he worked through his own firm's proposals. He had reviewed her contracts. He had connected her to 3 commercial real estate contacts who became clients. She had built a successful commercial practice on the foundation of those first clients. He had never mentioned his role in it. It was not his practice to take credit for things that were hers to own. He had noticed the shift 2 years into the marriage, the phone that gathered charge on her nightstand rather than his, the Saturday mornings she went out for errands that lasted 4 hours, the way she had stopped asking about the Eastfield project, even though she had been asking about it every week for the previous year. He had told himself it was the natural distance that comes when 2 people are running hard in the same direction, without enough time to look at each other. He had extended the same trust he always extended. He had told himself it was a season. There had been a company dinner 14 months ago, the annual team event, a restaurant in the warehouse district, 34 employees and their guests. Dina had skipped it, as she usually did. Calvin had moved through the evening the way he always moved through company events, present, attentive, engaged with the team without performing it. Near the end of the evening, Anton Gale had found a moment beside him at the bar and asked casually, too casually, he would later understand, whether Mrs. Brooks ever attended the firm events. Calvin had said she usually preferred to skip them, gave him some space from the work, he had said. Anton had nodded and said that made sense. Calvin had noted the question the way he noted things, with the quiet, specific attention of a man who files what he can't yet categorize. He had not decided yet what it meant. He understood now what it had meant. Anton had been confirming an absence, making sure the paths were clear. He called Jeffrey Stills that Thursday evening at 8:14. Jeffrey was the kind of attorney who had seen situations before and treated none of them as exceptional. He asked 2 questions before he gave any advice. What do you know for certain, and what do you only believe? He had represented Calvin personally and the firm on legal matters for 9 years. He called early in the morning and stayed on a call until the problem was mapped. His voice never changed weight when the information was heavy. "Don't do anything that looks like reaction," Jeffrey said. "I'm going to call Delphine in the morning. Before you do anything else, I need the full employment file on Anton Gale." Delphine Marsh had been with Brooks Engineering since year 2. She was 60 years old, precise and unhurried, with reading glasses she pushed up to her forehead when she was thinking, and down to her nose when she was reading, which was most of the time. She had been the firm's office manager, then its administrator, and then the person who ran the internal operations while Calvin ran the work. She knew every file, every vendor, every expense line in 14 years of company records. She had also, as she told Jeffrey when he called, been watching certain things for about 6 months and had not yet decided who to bring them to. "Tell me what you kept," Jeffrey said. She was at Calvin's conference table by 9 that morning, with 3 organized sections and the firm's expense management system open on her laptop. "I'm going to walk through this in order," she said. "Let me finish before you respond." She opened the first section. Anton Gale had been submitting expense reports that Delphine's systematic review had flagged as inconsistent. Receipts for client entertainment on dates when the relevant clients had no scheduled engagement, mileage submissions for site visits to locations where no Brooks Engineering projects existed, equipment rentals billed to projects that had been completed and closed. She had started keeping a separate record 9 months ago. The total across 18 months, $127,000 in reimbursements that had no legitimate business basis. Calvin looked at the figure. He set the red pen down on the table. He picked it up again and held it. There's more. She opened the second section. 3 years of project records for the contracts Anton Gale had managed. Subcontractor selections, bid records, vendor approvals. In 7 separate contracts over the previous 2 years, a firm called Gale & Associates had been selected for specialized work, site assessments, material testing, technical consulting. Total payments to Gale & Associates from Brooks Engineering, $340,000. The disclosure requirement under the firm's vendor policy was clear and posted in the employee handbook. Any employee with a financial interest in a subcontractor was required to disclose that interest before any work was awarded. No disclosure had ever been filed. Jeffrey had pulled the state business registry that morning. Gale & Associates, LLC. Managing member, Anton R. Gale. Calvin sat with that document for a long time. He looked at the figure at the bottom. He added it to the first figure in his head. He set both hands flat on the table. One more thing, Delphine said. She opened her laptop. She had pulled the relevant Slack records under the firm's standard IT audit access. Records from the period 14 months ago, around the time of the company dinner. Anton's message history showed an exchange with a personal contact that began 2 days after the annual dinner. The contact's name was listed as a mutual acquaintance, someone Dina had introduced Calvin to at a professional event the previous spring. The exchange discussed a mutual introduction, a professional networking reception the following month, an introduction that was carefully positioned not to appear engineered. Anton had not met Dina by chance at a professional event. He had asked someone to engineer the introduction 2 days after confirming from Calvin himself that she would not be at company events. He had been working toward this for 14 months. Calvin stood up. He walked to the window of the conference room and looked at the street. The morning was gray and still. He stood there for a minute, maybe 2, just long enough for the full shape of it to settle into something he could work with. He turned back to the table and looked at everything together. The expense reports, the subcontractor records, the message history, the figure for the fraud, the 14 months of deliberate approach. Pull his termination paperwork, Calvin said, but don't deliver it yet. Jeffrey will tell you when. Delphine refilled his coffee. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. There was a knock at the conference room door. A junior project coordinator named Petra, 27, who had been with the firm for 11 months, was standing in the doorway. Her expression was the expression of someone who had been carrying something and had finally decided the weight of not saying it was greater than the weight of saying it. I heard about the review, she said. I didn't want to say anything and be wrong, but I also didn't want to say nothing and be right. She paused. There were 2 expense reports last quarter. I processed them. The receipts didn't match the dates on the client calendar. I thought I'd made a mistake. I kept copies. Calvin looked at her for a moment. You did the right thing, he said. Bring them to Delphine. Thank you. Petra. She nodded and left. He watched her go. He thought about 67 people and the files he had read and the decisions he had made. He thought about the one he had gotten wrong and about the ones he had gotten right, including evidently the 27th one. He didn't move fast. That was the part Anton had not been able to account for. He had built the plan around the assumption that discovery, if it came, would come in a visible way. A confrontation, a firing, something he could see coming and respond to. He had not built the plan around a man who didn't confront and didn't fire, who simply gathered information in the correct sequence while everything appeared completely normal. Anton had been coming into the office every morning, managing his projects, submitting his reports, responding to emails, conducting himself exactly as he always had, because he did not know that Delphine had been keeping a parallel record for 9 months. Because he did not know that Petra had kept copies, because he did not know that Jeffrey Stills had filed a civil fraud claim against him and Gale and Associates on a Friday afternoon when the news cycle was quiet and nobody was paying attention to the county court filings. He had not been terminated yet. That was coming. Jeffrey had a specific reason for the sequence. Dina's attorney reached out to Jeffrey twice in the 3 weeks after she left, proposing preliminary settlement terms. The proposals were based on an assessment of the marital estate that did not account for the financial damage Anton had caused the firm and did not account for the $185,000 that Delphine had found moving from the joint investment account to a personal account in Dina's name over the previous 4 months. Jeffrey acknowledged both communications. Calvin went to work every morning at 5:57. He marked up his documents in red. He ran his meetings the way he always ran them, in order on time, with decisions made before the meeting started whenever possible. Anton Gale sat in those meetings and did not know that the man at the head of the table had been reading the full picture for 3 weeks. On a Wednesday evening, Dina called Calvin directly. He picked up. "My attorney says you're not engaging," she said. Her voice was controlled and measured. "I'm not trying to draw this out." "I know," he said. "Then why won't Jeffrey respond to the terms?" "The terms are based on the wrong figures," he said. "Come to the settlement meeting. Bring Anton." A pause. "Why would Anton be at a settlement meeting?" "Because Jeffrey needs him there," Calvin said. "He'll understand when he arrives." He ended the call. Jeffrey was at the table across from him. He looked at Calvin for a moment. "She'll bring him," Calvin said. "I know," Jeffrey said. Calvin arrived at Jeffrey's office on the 23rd floor at 8:11 in the morning. The meeting was at 10. The conference room had a long table, 12 chairs, and windows along the east wall that let the morning light in flat and clean. On the table, Delphine had organized 4 binder sets, one for each party and their counsel, with the documents in the order Jeffrey had specified. Red tab dividers, the kind of organization that communicated that everything in the room had been read and marked. Calvin sat in the second chair from the near end, not the head, not the center, the position from which he could see both doors and everyone at the table. Jeffrey arrived at 8:40. Delphine at 9:05. A forensic accountant named Dr. Eves, who had reviewed Petra's records in the full expense audit, arrived at 9:20. Dina arrived at 9:57 with her attorney, a methodical woman named Ferris, who had presumably reviewed her client's financial disclosures and found them coherent. Anton Gale came through the door 2 steps behind them. He was in a jacket and tie. The jacket was one Calvin recognized. He had noticed it at a project site visit 18 months ago, the day Anton had presented the Eastfield subcontractor bids to the client. He had thought, "This man dresses for the rooms that matter." Anton's eyes moved across the conference room. They moved past Jeffrey, past Dr. Eves, past the organized binders. Then they landed on Calvin. Something happened in his face. It did not happen slowly. It was the specific compression of a man whose entire model of a situation has just been revised in a single second. He looked at Calvin. He looked at the binders. He looked at Delphine, whose expression was entirely neutral, and whose posture communicated that she had been in this room for a long time already. He sat down. Dina sat beside him. She had not registered anything yet. She was looking at Ferris, who was opening her portfolio. Jeffrey spoke first. "Before any discussion of settlement terms, I need to establish several material facts regarding the marital estate and certain matters affecting it. Directly." He opened the first binder. "I'm going to start with an employment record." He placed a single document on the table. Anton Gale. Positions near matter. Company. Brooks Engineering. Start date, June 11th, 3 years prior. Reporting to Calvin Brooks, founder and principal. He set it in front of Dina. She read it. She read it again. She looked up at Calvin. She looked at Anton. She looked back at the document. The expression that moved across her face was not simply shock. It was the specific expression of a person discovering that the narrative they have been living in has a room they never opened. She had believed she was leaving one world for a better one. She had not known the 2 worlds shared a foundation. "The individual seated across from you," Jeffrey said, without any change in tone, "has been an employee of your husband's firm for 3 years. I want that established before we proceed." Ferris had the document in her hand. Her expression communicated rapid recalculation. Jeffrey opened the second section. Dr. Eves walked through the expense audit, the $127 in fraudulent reimbursements, itemized by submission date and project. Then the Gale and Associates subcontractor payments, $340, in work awarded by an employee to an entity he owned and never disclosed. His voice was factual and even, the way you describe a structural failure, not to condemn it, but to show where the load had been placed incorrectly. He placed Petra's copies on the table. He placed the IT audit records. He placed the Slack message history from 14 months ago, the engineered introduction, the 2 days after the annual dinner, the contact who had been recruited to broker the meeting. Anton Gale had not said a word since he sat down. The civil fraud filing, Jeffrey said, placing the last document, was submitted 11 days ago. It names Anton Gale and Gale Associates LLC as defendants. The total exposure is $467,000. He closed the binder. Mr. Gale's employment at Brooks Engineering was terminated this morning, effective immediately, by written notice delivered to his home address at 7:15. He will find it when he returns. The room was quiet, the kind of quiet that arrives when something structural has been removed, and everyone in the room is waiting to see what falls. Calvin stood. He buttoned his jacket. He pulled the cap off his red pen. He had brought it out of habit, had not written a single mark, and capped it again. He shook Jeffrey's hand. He shook Dr. Eves's hand. He nodded to Delphine. He walked toward the door. He stopped. He turned back. He looked at Anton Gale directly, at a man whose file he had read, whose hand he had shaken, whose offer letter he had signed on a morning exactly like this, 14 years into building something he had been careful about from the first day. I built this firm on choosing the right people, Calvin said, quietly. For Anton, you're the first time in 14 years I was wrong. He walked out without looking back. It did not happen all at once. The civil fraud matter against Anton Gale and Gale & Associates moved through the system over the following 8 months. The $467,000 in documented exposure was the subject of a settlement negotiation that resolved in Brooks Engineering's favor. Anton's ability to work in the sector was materially affected by the public record of the proceedings, which his new employer, a firm he had been quietly courting for several months, believing he would leave on his own terms, elected not to overlook. Dina's settlement was based on the marital estate as it actually existed, adjusted to account for the $185,000 she had moved without disclosure. The commercial design practice she had built, in part on the first 3 clients Calvin had connected her to 6 years earlier, continued. She kept the practice. She kept the clients. She was building something that was genuinely hers, and whatever else was true, that part had always been real. She was not destroyed. She was simply returned to the version of her life that her choices had earned. The weight of what she hadn't known sat with her in the way things sit with people when they understand, too late, what they were actually standing on. Calvin went back to the work. He promoted Petra to project manager that fall, the youngest in the firm's history. He had read her file a second time before making the call, the way he read every file. He had found in it the same quality he always looked for, and almost always found. Someone who showed up when showing up was difficult. He had made the offer himself, the way he always made offers. He answered every call the same day. He kept every timeline. He marked up every document in red and handed it back with the marks visible. Brooks Engineering had 67 employees, and then 72, and then 78. His name was on the firm, on the contracts, on the bids, on the plans. It always had been. On a morning in late November, Calvin Brooks arrived at the office at 5:57 and made his coffee and sat at the drafting table in the corner and uncapped his red pen. The building was quiet. The city outside was not yet fully awake. The morning light came through the east windows in long, flat lines across the floor. He had a project brief in front of him, a new municipal contract, a transit infrastructure project, 3 counties, a 10-year implementation window, the kind of work that required the right people, in the right roles in exactly the right sequence. He had been reviewing the scope for 2 weeks. He had been thinking about the team he would build around it. He picked up the brief. He made his first mark in red, a note in the margin, a question about a load assumption in the preliminary design. He kept reading. Somewhere behind him, the first of his team began to arrive. He heard the elevator. He heard coffee being made in the kitchen. He heard the low sound of a building coming back to life for another day. He didn't look up. He had work to do before the meeting started. He always did. I hope you enjoyed that one. Be sure to like the video and subscribe so you don't miss the next story. I've picked out 2 more for you that I think you'll really like.